Hi, and welcome to our lecture series for Chapter 6 of your textbook. Chapter 6 is motion media, and it includes discussions of both TV and the movies. And because there's so much information, we're dividing this lecture series into two parts. So this is the lecture series about TV, about the television industry. I suspect that you've grown up watching a lot of TV in your life. Have you ever thought about the classifications of TV programs? That's where we're going to put our emphasis today, notably on the situation comedy, what we call the sitcom. It's a form of television programming that's been around ever since television has been around in the late 1940s, and we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about the importance of situation comedies to TV and to the culture. But let's make a note of the fact that sitcoms are only one classification of common TV programs. Maybe you grew up and had a favorite dramatic series that you watched, and it might have involved lawyers or cops and detectives. It might have involved people in medicine, doctors and nurse shows. A number of different types of dramatic series have been offered on TV since the late 1940s. Reality shows, on the other hand, are comparatively new compared to drama and sitcoms. Nonetheless, they are a very important aspect of the TV landscape today. News has been a part of television, again, almost since day one. But boy, the presentation, the way that news is gathered and the way that it's reported has changed dramatically over the roughly 70-year history of the medium. Game shows have been there since day one, as well as the soap operas. But the point I'd like to make, and we have made this already in Chapter 5 of the textbook, is that each one of these genres of television programming, with the exception of reality shows, came to us initially as radio broadcast. And, of course, with the radio medium, where the sound is the only component, obviously, as people listened in the 1920s and 1930s to situation comedies and to drama shows, all of the pictures were up in the head. TV brought these pictures to the screen, and when the medium was really getting its foothold by the early 1950s, these became the prominent forms of broadcasting on television. So one final note before we move ahead from that discussion is that what happened to the radio industry when so many of the stars and the creative behind-the-scenes people, the writers, the directors, so forth and so on, left the radio broadcasting of these programs and moved over and made the transition to television. Well, that's when radio was forced to reinvent itself, and the disc jockey concept of broadcasting on radio was born. And here you see on the right-hand side of the screen, here's a photo of a disc jockey in the 1950s. Look at the large turntables available to him for playing the discs at that time. The DJ, the disc jockey, became radio's answer when the soaps and the dramas and the comedies shifted from radio over to TV. Hey, have you ever seen a Western before? It may be hard to believe that this has been one of the most popular genres of drama in TV history. Maybe hard to believe because there are no or very few Westerns on broadcast television or on cable TV at the time that we're studying this chapter. But I did just want to call your attention to a couple of TV series from the 1950s and 60s that's important because if you look at the number of seasons that Gunsmoke and Bonanza aired on network television, 20 seasons and 14 seasons respectively, and look at the total number of one-hour episodes that were produced, 635 hours of Gunsmoke drama over 20 seasons. To say that it was an extremely popular TV show out of the Western genre, well, it's simply an understatement. Daniel Boone also became another popular Western of the 1960s, and just as a footnote to culture, you see the American Daniel Boone with his Native American companion Mingo. And what made this series outstanding was it was one of TV's first dramatic portrayals and depictions of two different cultures working together side to side for the common good. Now let's talk about TV as an industry or as a business. Your textbook author talks about the dual infrastructure of what we call terrestrial TV broadcasting. Terrestrial meaning over the surface of the earth, as opposed to satellite television broadcasting. And the dual infrastructure is this. For the entire history of terrestrial TV broadcasting, networks have been organized to connect TV stations, local stations around the country, and deliver programming to them, which the local stations in turn transmit to us, to individual TV viewers around the United States. Today, the network structure it's still important and it's still relevant, but it's simply not as important as it once was. Cable television and some of the cable TV networks began to diminish the importance of TV networks beginning as early as the mid-1980s, and then more recently the internet and the programming services like Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime have further helped to sort of fracture the TV landscape. So while ABC, CBS, NBC, and Fox, along with the CW, still have relevance and importance today, it's not quite the same as it was, let's say, a generation ago or even 2 generations ago, because other forms of competition have come in play. You might think that cable television is a relatively new phenomenon, relatively new, let's say maybe in the last, 20 or 30 years, but in fact, cable TV had its origins way back in the 1940s, much the same as the time that TV broadcasting began. Cable TV today, we probably think about the fact that if we subscribe to a cable TV service, the benefit is that we get hundreds and hundreds of channels that we can choose from. Well, the fact of the matter is cable TV did not come into being simply to add additional channels to TV. It came into being out of necessity. And that necessity was that there were certain portions of the United States, western Pennsylvania being one of the most important areas, which is a very mountainous region. And whenever you have mountains that separate or come in between, let's say, a television broadcasting station's antenna and a home that might be 10 to 40 or 50 miles away from the TV broadcasting station, if the mountainous region is between the TV broadcaster and the viewer's home, the TV signal does not have a way of penetrating the mountains and making its way to the viewer's home. And so the idea was to construct a large master receiving antenna, let's say on the top of a mountain, and then connect that antenna to all of the homes down the mountainside and in the valley, and to share that common TV signal among a multitude of homes in that area. And so connecting the homes to the master antenna was done by an electric cable, and thus we have the beginnings of cable TV. It's only about 40 years after that, in the late 1970s and 1980s, that cable really began to enlarge and to bring multiple channels of programming into viewers' homes. We're talking about broadcasting in this chapter, but it's also equally important to talk about a newer term called narrowcasting, and that is the direct result of the proliferation of cable TV and the number of channels that cable TV can provide. Whereas early on in the history of TV, when most Americans in the 1950s and 1960s had maybe 3 channels to choose from, it was quite common for all members of the family to gather together and watch programming as a group, as a family. But as cable TV brought more and more channels into the home, the audience began to fragment, began to divide, began to break up, if you will. And mom and dad had a TV to watch their programs on. Maybe the teenagers in the house had sets in their bedrooms where they could watch. Maybe the children had channels that they wanted to watch in the family room. And so all of a sudden, thanks to the extensive expansion of the number of different programs and channels that became available, it no longer, the idea of watching TV no longer was thought of as broadcasting, but rather as narrowcasting. And I would note that this is a trend or a phenomenon that's not unique to the TV industry. Actually, it really began with the magazine industry, probably 100 years ago, when it became possible for magazine publishers to create and publish and distribute magazines that had very narrow, very specific appeals to certain kinds of readers. Go out to a Barnes & Noble sometime. Take a look at the magazine rack and the number of titles that are available there, and I think you'll easily see that there is this parallel between the magazine industry and the cable TV industry. Through much of your life, satellite TV has been a dominant distribution network, means for distributing, through 2 commercial satellite TV services, DirecTV, which not too long ago was purchased by AT&T, the telephone and internet provider, and then the competitor to DirecTV is a company called Dish Network. And perhaps you grew up in a home that had service from one or the other of these 2 program providers. Now, as we speak today, out of the 2, DirecTV is the larger company, larger in the sense that it has more subscribers than Dish Network does. That in and of itself, of course, does not make one better than the other, or the other, less valuable than the other. Both of them use a technology, and I feel rather certain that you probably have seen a satellite TV receiving dish before. Think of an apparatus the size of a large pizza pan, maybe 20 inches in diameter, that is mounted to a rooftop or to the side of a house, perhaps even on a support pole out in the yard. And each of these satellite dishes are directed upward into the southwestern sky, where the satellites for both of these 2 TV providers are located. Satellite TV became the alternative to cable TV, and it became an important alternative because satellite TV could be established in places where cable TV has even today yet to extend. And it may be that you grew up in a rural area, or maybe you had family or friends who live in rural areas that still today aren't serviced and don't have cable TV service available to them. And so satellite reception becomes the alternative for them because they are not able to access cable TV. But that doesn't mean that both DirecTV and Dish Network have not had success in cities and suburban areas as well, and for a variety of reasons. It could be features, it could be the number of channel choices, it could even be price. But the combination of factors has led to a situation today where a number of cable TV subscribers have cut the cord and dropped those subscriptions and have moved over to satellite TV reception. And in fact, what is happening today is more cord cutting, or more cutting is going on, And we find a number of younger people in particular who are not only subscribing to cable TV, but they also are not subscribing to satellite TV because they have gone to the internet channels. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that as we look at this logo for DirecTV Now. You may or may not be familiar with this service, but DirecTV Now for approximately 12 months or so has been providing the same kinds of TV programming, both live and recorded, that it distributes over the satellite. It's providing that same programming now over the internet, and in many instances at a lesser price. So if we want to regard this as a thing of the future, it's certainly in its infancy right now. But all of the predictions that I'm reading suggest that this is going to be the delivery method of the future. We need to speak for just a moment about the DVR, the digital video recorder. It may be part of the receiving package for your cable TV subscription or your satellite subscription, or maybe you or your parents have purchased a TiVo, a standalone device that will record TV programming. When you record a program and watch it later, that activity is termed by the industry as time shifting. And it's done sometimes out of necessity. Maybe you aren't available at a particular time to sit down and watch a program, and you want to watch it later. But maybe more and more often, the reason for recording the program is that once you watch the recording, you have the availability, the opportunity to skip past the commercials. And so that certainly raises a whole number of questions about what happens when the advertisers no longer want to pay to put their ads into TV commercials because people are not watching them, they're skipping past them. Also in the chapter, and just a brief mention about the idea of product placement, and here you see at the bottom of the slide a screen capture from several years ago of the reality program American Idol. And what's important about that is to note that those three containers, those three glasses that have the Coca-Cola logo on them, do not appear on that program by accident. This is an instance of product placement where Coca-Cola has paid the producer of American Idol a rather large sum to ensure that the judges are seen in the presence of Coca-Cola products and not of a competitor such as Pepsi-Cola or maybe some other beverage that's non-carbonated. I think if we need to talk about trends in this instance, the trend is that over time and in the future, we're going to see more product placement rather than less. Now, let's talk about situation comedies, one of the most important forms of TV programming. What you're looking at on this screen is the title screen for the sitcom I Love Lucy, a TV program that starred Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz and was undeniably the most important TV sitcom in the earliest days of TV in the 1950s. But the interesting thing of note here is that the last episode of this TV series was produced in 1957. And still today, this program, reruns of this program that were produced from 1951 to 1957, are still seen and watched by millions of people on TV today. The screen capture that you see on the right comes from an episode of I Love Lucy, I think in 1956. And this is where Lucy, the character Lucy, gets her break as a TV commercial spokeswoman in this new medium of television. And we'll have more to say about this as we progress through the lecture. Now let's look at some characteristics of making, if you will, a television situation comedy. TV sitcoms are manufactured products much the same as light bulbs and automobiles. There's a certain method to the process of creating a TV situation comedy, and it begins in the writer's room, where we have talented, creative people who can take an established situation such as the I Love Lucy broadcast and take the characters who regularly appear in this program and write scripts week after week after week that have the fictional stories of the things that these characters are going to do and have happen to them in each weekly episode. And I dare say that the creation of a script for really most any TV program, whether it's a dramatic series or a situation comedy, that process of creating that script and then filming the TV episode from that script is much like any type of manufacturing. It's done according to a set of protocols, an established set of procedures that helps to ensure that each week the producers of the program can deliver a brand new episode of the program to the network that broadcasts it. Each episode of a TV situation comedy that's 30 minutes in length is actually only about 22 minutes long when you take out time for commercials. So within that 22-minute period of time, the comedy script is broken down into several narrative scenes. And I would suggest that we can view this process of how the writers come up with the ideas for things to happen to the characters, that they follow a formula. Or you might even want to look at it as a recipe. We get these ingredients together, we mix it up, and we have a finished product. And that is very much the way that you can view the process of creating a TV situation comedy. Now, I know this is very simplistic, but let's talk about the steps that go on. If you think about almost any TV situation comedy that you grew up watching, I'll bet if you think through and analyze the plot and unpack what happens in any 20-minute, 22-minute or so episode, you'll find this to be true. The first thing the writers do is to establish a situation. The characters have to have something that they're going to do and something that is going to happen to them during the episode. At some point early on, 7 or 8 or 9 minutes into the series, the writers have to find some way to make the situation a little more complicated, because it's in creating these complications that the comedy will flow. As the situation becomes more complicated, we move into the third step, and that is to find some way to increase the amount of confusion that is going on amongst the characters. Now, again, I'm being very general, very simplistic in this discussion, but I suspect if you give it some thought, you'll find what I'm saying will apply to almost any episode of a sitcom that you've ever watched. The fourth part of the recipe or the formula, at the end of the program, as we narrow down to the end of the 22 minutes, something in the script has to come in and make the conflict of the situation go away. It has to be alleviated. We have to resolve what is happening in the script. In other words, we need to find a way where everybody lives happily ever after. Why? Because we've got to have a new situation and a new plot next week on the next 22-minute episode. So keep these four plot developing characteristics in mind, and we'll use these as a springboard for discussion both later in this lecture and when we're together again in the classroom. Let's continue the discussion now with a more recent sitcom, this one out of the 1990s on ABC. If you've never seen an episode of the Tim Allen sitcom Home Improvement, check out Moodle. I've put a link to the very first episode of Home Improvement back in 1991. This screen capture that you see on the left-hand side of the screen comes from that episode. This is where we establish the characters of Tim and Jill and the three sons and the people that are seen each week in Home Improvement. And perhaps you've seen this episode before. The pilot episode was the one where Tim somehow manages to supercharge the dishwasher in the kitchen, except that as he usually does, he goes overboard and the thing blows up on him. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of the characters in situation comedies. By and large, a character in a sitcom never undergoes extreme or profound trouble. Yes, certain things may happen to them, and they may suffer some superficial injury, or something may give them a sort of a temporary setback. But this is not drama, and this is not the place nor the time to be dealing with a situation that is going to dramatically alter the balance across the characters. So most of the complications tend to be rather superficial. They tend to be external situations as opposed to internal. It's sort of difficult in a situation comedy to find comedy and emotional stress, something that's going on internally with a character actor. And so most of the time, the stressful situation occurs somewhere external to the characters, such as if you look in the lower hand portion in the left-hand side of the screenshot, where Tim's supercharged dishwasher blew a hole in the cabinetry in the kitchen. That's an external situation example. So the emotional strain, the emotional stress typically is not a part of the character development in a situation comedy. Now, our third example that we could talk about, one even more recently out of the 2000s, The Big Bang Theory, is undoubtedly one of the most successful of the situation comedies, not only of the 2000s, but I would dare say out of the entire history of TV. This program, I think, is close to maybe its 10th season, and at various times has been the number one rated situation comedy in all of television. Very successful, and perhaps because the creators and the writers for this program have done such an excellent job in creating characters and giving these characters personality and characteristic traits that the viewing audience can identify with, can appreciate, and most importantly, can laugh with. So, 3 bullet points here: characteristics in situation comedies. The main characters tend to be stable and predictable. Now, certainly, a lot of argument could be made about how stable Sheldon is in The Big Bang Theory, but he certainly, week to week, episode to episode, season to season, is predictable. We know in advance, if you watched any number of episodes of Big Bang, you know how Sheldon is going to behave in particular situations. And to that extent, that's what makes him stable in that role. We know that Penny and Sheldon also have characteristic traits. And if the writers were to write a script in such a way that would cause them to deviate from those established character patterns, we probably, as viewers, wouldn't appreciate that. We watch Big Bang Theory because it's been around long enough now. It's comfortable to us. We know who the characters are. We know what to expect of them. So they're stable and predictable. Now, over the life of the series, and I think this is a good example because we're into close to 10 seasons of Big Bang Theory, the characters really don't develop too much. Now, certainly marriages happen, characters die off in the case of Wolowitz's mother. But by and large, Sheldon and Leonard are pretty much the same people today as they were when that episode series began so many years ago. Characteristic of a sitcom is that plot twists play a much more important role in advancing the comedy than does information about how the characters develop. And again, I know you're probably itching to shout out, I can think of something that happened in The Office or something on Modern Family that doesn't conform to what you're talking about here. And perhaps not. What I'm trying to do is to shoot for the average and just tell you that over the 70-plus year history of sitcoms on TV, that this formula and these pieces of information that I've shared with you generally apply to a large number of sitcoms, but I'm not asserting that every sitcom is exactly this way and that this applies to every sitcom. Now we shift gears for just a moment. Let's talk about one of the most important decades in recent United States history. That was the 1960s. This is long before you were born. And so what I'm going to do now is to try and help you understand why this particular period of American history had such a tremendous impact on the development of television in that decade, but more importantly, as we know TV today. The 1960s was an exciting decade. It was the 10-year period of time in which President Kennedy in the early 1960s predicted that the United States would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and in fact, in 1969, we did place an American on the surface of the moon and return him home safely. President Kennedy, and again, I have maybe some suspicions of what you might know about him and his presidency. He was the successor to President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. President Eisenhower was an older president. He was a military man, very stern, and a taciturn type of individual. And Americans were looking for change in 1960 when they elected John Kennedy as president. Now take a look at the photograph that you see on the screen, probably made around 1961 or 1962. President Kennedy was the youngest of our American presidents. He was, I believe, 42 years old at the time of his inauguration. He had a younger, extremely attractive, physically attractive wife named Jacqueline, and everybody referred to her as Jackie. And he had two young children. The daughter, Caroline, is seen in the foreground, and then sitting by his mother is young John Kennedy Jr. And it's hard for me to explain exactly just how much Americans were in love with the Kennedys and the Kennedy presidency in the early 1960s. A dramatic change from the presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, and President Kennedy both brought youth and vigor, an attractive family, and a lot of promise to Americans in the 1960s. He was an extremely popular president, even if a person didn't exactly agree with his political philosophy. There was still a lot to like about President Kennedy, simply because of who he was and who his family was. Now, I suspect you're wondering, why in the world did we interrupt our discussion about situation comedies to have this discussion about the presidency of John Kennedy? And the reason is because of what happened on a Friday afternoon in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. This was the day that President John F. Kennedy, when he was riding in a presidential motorcade through the streets of downtown Dallas, Texas, and at about 12:30 in the afternoon, 3 rifle shots rang out in a section of town called Dealey Plaza, and 2 of those 3 bullets struck President Kennedy, and within the hour, President Kennedy was declared dead. Now, the reason I'm having this discussion with you right now is not so much to go back and unpack the history of the Kennedy presidency or of the Kennedy political philosophy. I want to have this discussion with you now to help you better understand how the events of the weekend of November 22nd, 1963, helped to completely revolutionize what was happening in TV news at that time. Historians talk about the TV coverage following the shooting of the president as a time when TV news came of age. It's important for me to share with you, in case you're not familiar with this, the fact that the presentation of news on TV in 1963 was quite different than what we know it today, mostly because of changes in technology. TV news, obviously, because of the medium that TV is extremely dependent on pictures, on moving pictures, and the broadcast of live moving pictures. And to do so requires a certain amount of technology. And for the most part, some of that technology did not exist in 1963. So let me begin by saying this. At the time that President Kennedy's motorcade was traveling in the parade route through the city of Dallas, Texas, there was no live TV coverage of the parade. Now, I have placed into Moodle the link to a documentary that CNN produced several years ago, and I'm going to ask you to watch about the first 22 minutes of this 45-minute documentary. I want you to develop some sense by watching this of the importance of the assassination of President Kennedy to the history of the United States, and in this instance to the history of TV coverage of news events. And as you watch this documentary, you will be seeing footage that was made by an amateur film camera that recorded the scene of the president being shot. Perhaps you have seen this footage before. Perhaps you haven't. I will advise you that it is graphic in nature. But please understand that this is what you're seeing at the time of the shooting is not live TV coverage of what happened that day. There were no live cameras. There was no live TV coverage at the time that the president was shot. Also in the video, as you get close to that 22-minute mark, and this is where I really would like for you to be observing what was happening, you'll get to see what it would be like in the instance of CBS TV news anchor Walter Cronkite, who broadcast from CBS Studios the evening news every afternoon at 5:30 from studios in New York City. And Walter Cronkite, the anchor for the 5:30 newscast, was in his office in New York City at the time when around 1:30 in the afternoon, the news of a shooting at the president's motorcade in Dallas made its way into the newsroom at CBS in New York, as well as to the newsrooms of all TV networks, all newspapers, and all radio stations. This news of the shooting spread quickly, but as you can imagine, in any tragic event of this nature, there was some erroneous news to trickle in, and a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns. It was a very, very chaotic time in the television news industry. But as you get close to the 22-minute mark and the break in this documentary, you'll be watching Walter Cronkite as he was interrupted from having his lunch in his office to be told to rush to the TV studio. You have to get on the air and broadcast to millions of Americans this news about the shooting and the possible death of America's beloved president as he was being driven through a parade in the streets of downtown Dallas, Texas. Now, this happened midway around noon on a Friday afternoon in late November. The president was officially declared dead about an hour later, at about 1:30 our time on that Friday afternoon. And from the time of that announcement until the time the president's body was laid to rest in Arlington Cemetery just outside Washington, D.C., 4 days later on a Monday afternoon, the three major television networks broadcast nothing but news about the events that were unfolding. There were no sitcoms or dramatic series. There were no commercials broadcast out of respect to the president's family. The coverage ran continuously for 4 days, unprecedented. But what's important to understand is that this is how television news came of age. TV brought into the living room of Americans pictures that 10 and 20 and 30 years ago could not have been possible. It was remarkable in what TV news coverage did to help people understand what had happened to the president and what is happening to his family, and to understand how America is going to be plunged into a period of deep mourning and grief over the loss of their beloved President Kennedy. It's hard for me to relate to you just the sense of staggering loss that Americans felt over the death of this president. Nothing like it had ever happened before. Nothing has happened like it since. But the fact that TV cameras were positioned in certain places to bring coverage of the events surrounding the assassination of the president, it just made TV into a mass communication medium, a window to the world that people could not pull away from. Americans sat, with eyes glued to the TV set for much of the 4-day period of coverage. I feel like maybe I'm overselling this to you, but I want you to understand just how important the coverage of these events over the 4 days of President Kennedy's assassination and burial, how important that this was to America. Now, as I mentioned a while ago, out of respect to the president and the office of the president, the three networks did not broadcast any commercial messages during the time of the coverage. And I think that is extremely important to note, because the broadcasting of commercials, which are paid for by advertisers, are the only way that TV networks and TV stations have of making money. And so in addition to all of the expense of setting up cameras and providing this live, continuous, nonstop coverage, not only in addition to that expense, but the networks were not making any money in return for broadcasting commercials, because they were not broadcasting commercials during that time. It cost the network an untold number of millions of dollars to bring this coverage to America and to Americans. This is part of the public service nature of broadcasting that we have talked about previously. On this screen at the bottom, you see the image of CBS TV anchor Walter Cronkite. And this is a screenshot right at the time that he was announcing to Americans that their beloved president had just been pronounced dead at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Now, I've questioned a couple of times, what does this discussion about the TV coverage of the assassination of President Kennedy have to do, how does it sit within the middle of a discussion about, of all things, TV situation comedies? Well, let me see if I could explain. What you see on the screen now are shots from 4 of the most popular TV shows of the 1960s. These were shows that were being broadcast at the time when President Kennedy was assassinated and was in office. Out of the 4 that you see, certainly in 1962 and 1963, the most popular of these sitcoms was the one that you see pictured in the upper right-hand corner. and that's the Beverly Hillbillies. The Beverly Hillbillies is the story of an unbelievably poor family living in the Ozark Mountains of western Missouri, and oil was discovered on their property. And the discovery of oil made them immensely wealthy overnight, and they moved from the hills of the Ozarks to the most elegant and luxurious suburb in all of the United States, to Beverly Hills, California. And that juxtaposition of hillbillies in rich Beverly Hills is where much of that comedy came from. Now, here's what's important to understand. When President Kennedy was assassinated, America went into both an official and an unofficial state of mourning, officially for 30 days until shortly before Christmas of that year. But the loss of this extremely popular president led Americans, even beyond that time, into a sense of uncertainty and a sense of prolonged sadness. And you might recall from our discussion of Chapter 13 about media effects, one of the ways that we use the mass media content, in this instance we use TV programs, is for what is called escapism, where we can get out of our daily struggles, get out of our daily emotional situations and things that stress us, and we can get lost in watching a TV program or a movie. And in this instance, it's been asserted that one of the places where Americans chose to get lost, to escape from their misery, was of all things in watching this program called the Beverly Hillbillies. And an episode that was broadcast in early January 1964. This is about 6 weeks after the death of the president. And the episode in which the character Granny, who you see seated on the truck in the upper right-hand corner of that image, the character Granny, the writers created a situation where, after drinking some moonshine, she believes and mistakes a kangaroo at their house for being a giant jackrabbit. Now, as preposterous as that scenario is, when it was filmed and when it was presented to America in early January 1964, it became the single most watched episode of a TV program, a 30-minute program, ever. Millions and millions of Americans got lost in the zaniness, the silliness, the unbelievability of an old Ozarks Mountain lady getting soused up on moonshine and mistaking a kangaroo for being a giant jackrabbit. Now that says something about the power of the TV situation comedy. And I'll have some video to show you about this in the classroom. Each one of the 4 sitcoms that you see pictured on the screen here, from Green Acres to the Beverly Hillbillies to Gomer Pyle, USMC, and the Andy Griffith Show, share some characteristics. They were all broadcast on the CBS network. They were all programs that were seen in the 1960s, and they were all very popular programs. Highly rated sitcoms watched by millions of people. Let me repeat that. These were highly rated sitcoms watched by millions of people. Why is that important? In 1969, CBS canceled all 4 of these programs plus about a dozen others. The question is why? Why would a TV network take its highest rated, most watched programs and cancel them? Take them off the air, not to be seen in new episodes again? Well, this is an important lesson about the nature of mass comm, so let me explain. The reason that CBS took these programs off the air, despite the fact that they had millions of viewers, is that in the nature of the TV business, these were the wrong viewers. These were the wrong viewers. Now, what do we mean by that? What do we mean by wrong? Their characteristics largely were these. The audiences were too old and too rural for CBS to be able to sell the commercial time within the programs, plural, to advertisers. In other words, the companies that were making products that they wanted to sell to Americans, by and large, weren't interested in selling them to rural old people. People who had already made up their minds about which products that they were going to buy, and the fact that they were rural typically meant lower income, and in fact, for certain advertisers of certain products, the audiences didn't have the money in order to be able to afford to buy the products. And so CBS, in recognizing this, literally just took a hatchet to their TV weekly schedule and chopped it all up and got rid of about 12.5 TV programs. Well, that meant that they had to come in and try something different, bring new programs in an effort to attract younger audiences, younger viewers that were living not in the rural areas of the United States, but in the cities and the suburban areas. And CBS put a number of programs on the air as replacements, and some of them caught on with viewers, some of them didn't. But one that I want to call to your attention that did catch on, and catch on in a big way, is the sitcom called All in the Family. And for whatever you might know about Beverly Hillbillies or the Andy Griffith Show, this ain't those, okay? Pardon my French, but All in the Family is a different animal. All in the Family is a sitcom set not in rural America, but in New York City, in the Bronx, in one of the boroughs of New York City. And it's a classic clash of culture between mom and dad and the daughter and the son-in-law that she has married. It's a classic clash between conservative and liberal politics. It's a classic clash between the sexes. And this program brought to the TV audience subjects and language that had never before been heard on TV. It was a complete 180-degree reversal from what had been popular in TV up until that time. If you've never seen an episode of All in the Family, we're going to watch a portion of one in class, and I will share with you what's important about that episode once we get together in the classroom. We're running long on this lecture, so I'll wrap up things right quickly. It's important to note the importance today of Netflix to TV viewing, particularly for those of you that are younger rather than older like I am. Not to say that I'm not a Netflix subscriber, but I'm also a DirecTV subscriber and watch traditional satellite TV. But for many millennials today, Netflix and Hulu, Amazon Prime, and some of the other video services mean that you probably will never be a cable TV or a satellite TV subscriber. There's just times are changing, and there are different ways of delivering TV programming. So we've covered most of the main points, I think, out of the TV portion of Chapter 6 of your textbook. And as I said, a number of video examples that we'll be taking a look at when we get to class. So thanks, I appreciate your attention, and I'll see you in the next chapter.